Welcome back to The Heat. We're discussing the legacy of Singapore's first Premier, Lee Kuan Yew. With us once again from New York is Dr. Zhang Wang. He is Director at the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Seton Hall University. Also in New York is Dr. Tai-heng. He's from Singapore and is a legal scholar and lawyer with the international law firm Quinn Emanuel. And from Cambridge, Massachusetts, we're joined by Graham Allison. He's the Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you again for joining us. Dr. Zhang, let me join you again. Let me ask you again. Lee is gone. His son is now in charge. So in that respect, are his policies firmly entrenched with the son continuing the traditions of the father?
Yeah. Of course, that because when we talk about the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, people will normally think that okay, his successor should follow his policy. But I think I want to add this comment is, it is no doubt Lee Kuan Yew made a major, tremendous, unthinkable contribution to his country. But we have to understand many of his policy in the context of his time. But his time has also gone. I have been living in Singapore 2 years ago. I can understand today the situation changed, and many people in Singapore, they may have some different ideas, especially among the young people. So I think the best way to follow his policy maybe is not just simply continue his policy, copy his policy, not change anything. It's actually the more I think one of the major characteristics of Lee Kuan Yew's politicals is actually, adaptive, being adaptive. And so I think his son, his successor should also, being adaptive to the new situation and making adjustment according to the different context, different situation. I think the politics of Singapore has opened a new chapter. And it's something, it should be, many of the policy may be following his Lee Kuan Yew's policy, but there should be some new policy, some new strategy and a new approach.
Well, let me ask our other two guests for their views on change in Singapore. First, you, Graham Allison. Were the policies that Lee Kuan Yew followed policies that were good for his time, but right now Singapore needs to adapt and change and perhaps reform the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, I agree entirely with what Dr. Zhang said. I think he's got exactly the right notion. So Lee Kuan Yew was not about ideology. He would always say, I'm not an ideologist. I'm not even very interested in theory. I'm about what works. So he was always extremely pragmatic and adaptive to the situation that he confronted. The difficulty that Singapore will have now, as it's had for the last decade, and it'll have for the next several, is that no longer can it essentially play catch-up. It's unfortunately, or fortunately, but in any case, it's come to the front line now. It lives on the frontier, on the edge. And on the frontier and edge, you can't simply copy what somebody else did in another situation. You've got to figure out new things, different things. And figuring out new things and different things is difficult, and also they don't always work. So I would say that the future of Singapore is bright, but it's going to be bright not by simply trying to just keep doing what it's been doing in the past. And I'm confident that the current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, will be thinking pragmatically, which is really the tradition of Lee Kuan Yew, and adaptively, which is the legacy of Lee Kuan Yew, not some sort of fixed model or some just repeating, doing whatever worked in the past.
Dr. Tai-heng, does Singapore have to look at changing right now? I want to read to you what a Hong Kong political risk analyst said about Singapore. He said, Singapore needs a new strategy yet again. It's not going to be like the past, where the People's Action Party will decide what it is and just announce it to the population. There has to be change. Government has to be inclusive. That's what the political risk analyst had to say. Do you agree?
Well, it's a broad question as to what policies ought to continue. And if I may first start with a small point of chronology. Of course, Lee Kuan Yew stepped down a quarter of a century ago as Prime Minister. Before the current Prime Minister, there was another Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, who was in power for more than 10 years. And so really there has been a period of evolution already. And when we talk about policies continuing, I'm fairly confident, for example, some baseline policies such as zero tolerance for corruption will continue. When we talk about adapting, one could look both at the economic adaptations and the political adaptations. Starting first with the economic, Singapore began and grew its economy as a trading port with manufacturing, but that's since evolved into financial services and the legal industry. The government's put great emphasis and achieved great growth in my field, international arbitration. And even in the energy sector, it's not just the oil majors which are in Singapore. Service companies like the Holloman Corporation in Texas has moved its international headquarters to Singapore. And so the adaptation has been taking place. It will continue taking place. I think Singapore's economy will continue growing as a money center for that region of the world. And so, you know, in terms of responding to the Hong Kong analyst, I don't think he was speaking about just the economy, but perhaps referring to the political climate. And there, we've seen the government already become more inclusive. There's a lot of focus by the cabinet in explaining their policies to the population better. And I think the next step is for the political leaders to show greater empathy, and for Singaporeans of all ages to feel an empathetic connection with their leaders. And certainly this period of mourning and celebration for the life and achievements of Lee Kuan Yew provides a great impetus for the nation coming together and feeling the bonds of community and progressing that way on a go-forward basis.
Graham Allison, I'm going to get back to something you said earlier on. You said, you know, you consider the two great grand masters of international strategy to be Henry Kissinger and Lee Kuan Yew. Henry Kissinger, in fact, will be at the funeral for Lee Kuan Yew coming up in just a few days. What was the relationship between Kissinger and Lee Kuan Yew?
Well, very, very interesting. They immediately sort of understood each other as grand masters of strategy. And as Henry says in the preface of this book that I did, The Grand Master, that he's had the opportunity in the last half century to meet virtually every leader in the world, but from none of them did he learn more than from Lee Kuan Yew. Indeed, and then when asked to identify what specific feature of Lee Kuan Yew impressed him, he said, quote, "It was his singular strategic acumen." So basically, Lee Kuan Yew's capacity for looking into a chessboard, and you and I would see maybe one move, maybe two moves, and we would think our situation was rather dire, and he could look 6 moves ahead and see that there was going to become an opportunity, was a fascinating capacity. And I think in that sense, he and Henry Kissinger were fellow grand masters in a way that if I ask myself about whom else do I see in the world today that has such vision, unfortunately, one of those lights has dimmed.
Dr. Zhang, Lee's counsel was sought by the United States. It was sought by other world leaders. They wanted to know his insights on China and for what was referred to as Asian values. Did he in many ways bridge the gap, the division between the United States and China?
Yes, I think Lee Kuan Yew, maybe if we talk about diplomacy, I don't think he played a role as kind of a mediator or facilitator between China and U.S., but he indeed played a quite important role as advisors, consultant to both sides, and also provide a lot of insights. And so to some extent, he played the role as a bridge to helping the Chinese leader knowing more about the Western world, and also helping the leaders in the Western countries knowing more about China, because he's one of the unusual Asian leader who knows both Asia and the West quite well. And so from that aspect, I think he somehow played the role as kind of like a translator, interpreter. and helping the, especially the Chinese leader in the 1980s, they lack of a lot of experience and knowledge about, working with the Western leaders. And so they're seeking advice from Lee Kuan Yew, but at the same time, in the United States, they also trying to get some advices from Lee Kuan Yew to know better about China. And especially, I think, he was one of the earliest, leaders from Asia countries. I think he pursued a kind of like a double-track policy. That is, he chose to work with China very closely on economic development, trade, but choose to work with the United States on security and military cooperation. So it's like a double-track policy, but he handled it very well. So, and Singapore actually, played a very kind of like a, it's belonged to the interest of Singapore. And so this kind of policy now has been followed by many of the other Southeast Asian leaders.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. We leave you now with more pictures from Singapore as the nation says goodbye to its beloved leader. Stay with CCTV America on the air and web for continuing coverage of Lee Kuan Yew's funeral. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.